Hi, I'm Stanley Nelson, and I'm the director of Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool.
Music has always been like a curse with me. It's the first thing in my life. Go to bed thinking about it and wake up thinking about it. That's all I live for.
Miles started very early.
He looked at things differently. He saw things differently. Without a doubt, the most unique person I've ever known.
They wanted to be an artist just like Stravinsky.
We wanted to be Miles Davis.
Miles's audience was changing, absorbing what was happening now.
If anybody wants to keep creating, they have to be about change. I lost my sense of discipline and started to drift. Before I knew it, I had a heroin habit.
Miles becomes representative of a kind of cool, kind of sophistication, a kind of masculinity.
Miles and Frances. I mean, we were a hot couple.
And the elevator opened, and there he was. It was like in a movie when you meet the vampire and you know you're gonna die and you don't care.
He becomes our Black Superman.
All I ever wanted to do was communicate what I felt through music.
That is the trailer for the documentary Miles Davis, The Birth of the Cool. And this is Factual America. We're brought to you by Alamo Pictures, a London-based production company making documentaries about America for international audiences. Today we're talking about Miles Davis, the iconic trumpeter and composer, and helping us to learn more about one of the most influential figures in 20th century music and the challenges of bringing his life to the big screen is acclaimed director and producer Stanley Nelson. Stanley, welcome to Factual America. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you. It's an honor. The film we're talking about today is Miles Davis, Birth of the Cool. I gather originally out on the American Experience series on PBS, but now out on Netflix, I believe also Amazon Prime, Apple, and other streaming platforms. So thanks again so much for coming onto the podcast, and thanks for making this film. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Now I'm going to ask you a question I can't believe I'm asking, but I'm also aware that it's, believe it or not, almost 30 years since Miles Davis passed away. And so for a lot of our listeners may not even really know who Miles Davis is, believe it or not. Probably hard for you and I to believe, but maybe you can give us a little synopsis of who Miles Davis was.
Yeah, Miles Davis's career was so expansive that I'll try to be as short as but Miles Davis was a trumpet player from East St. Louis. He went to New York in around the middle of the 1940s. When he was 18, he had a scholarship to Juilliard, but he quickly migrated to the jazz scene and played with everybody, from Charlie Parker on down, Dizzy Gillespie, everybody. And he became one of the most celebrated musicians of the 20th century. He changed jazz, 3 or 4 or 5 times. Invented the kind of cool jazz when he issued an album called The Birth of the Cool in the early 50s. He invented kind of what's called hard bop afterwards, and then switched jazz altogether when he made the album Kind of Blue, which is still the largest selling jazz album in the history of music. One of the classic albums. If you don't know about Miles Davis, I suggest that you start with Kind of Blue. It's one of the greatest pieces of art in any century. I think that, I would challenge anybody to not like Kind of Blue. It's just almost a perfect album.
Yeah.
Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley and others. He then went on to kind of invent fusion music when he went electric and made an album called Bitches Brew. And so he was responsible for so many changes, not only in jazz, but also in music.
Yeah. I think you've done an amazing job summing it up, as hard as it is to do that in a matter of a couple minutes. I mean, and I would agree with you, Kind of Blue. There are not many albums I can listen to just on a loop and never get tired of. And I could have that on all day long.
It drives my wife crazy, but
I mean, that's one I often, I mean, this got me, I think the great thing about this film is that I don't know why, but some of his great albums but they've stayed on the shelf, and it got me thinking about some of these, whether it's sort of the Prestige era with, like, I've got working with the Miles Davis Quintet, Miles Ahead, Sketches of Spain, the work with Gil Evans. It's all just so iconic, and you've already talked about his hands and all the different, whether it's bebop, hard bop, cool jazz, acid jazz, fusion, onto rock, genre defying. I mean, he's sort of he is I was going to say the link, but he's really the almost the strand that takes jazz through the most of the 20th century, isn't he?
Yeah, like somebody said, he's the only person that even you could imagine playing from everybody from Charlie Parker to Prince. It's a clip of it with Prince near the end of it.
Yeah, I mean that's you do have that in the film. I hadn't realized he had performed with Prince, and that's it's his son who says they're like they were made for each other in some ways.
Yeah, they were talking about doing an album together, and but they did perform together a couple of times, and we were lucky enough to arrange from Prince's estate to actually get.
Yeah. I mean, you've already sort of touched on it, but I mean, what did he mean to jazz, and then what did he mean to music generally?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to describe, Miles and what he meant, just by kind of listing what he did, because the first thing is that, he was an innovator with everything that he did, and also that he created, incredible music. It wasn't like, Miles just said, oh, let me do an album, with a huge orchestra, like, film type orchestra, the music, that he did. But, he did it, and he innovated and just, did great things. So Miles was in so many ways, a leader in jazz and in music. So many rock groups have really, gotten so much out of, his later albums, like Bitches Brew, et cetera. We actually hear from rock musicians, kind of thank us for the film because they really got so much out of the film. I mean, he kind of invented the idea of jazz rock fusion. In the late '60s when he just said, hey, I want to do something different. I think that it's really telling that his son tells us later in the film that Miles never had his own albums around the house. He didn't listen to his own music because he was always ahead. He was on to the next thing, and just incorporating different sounds into his music. He in one album On the Corner, he has a tabla player, a sitar player. But again, it's not like oh, let's do something different to do something different. It's like he really created something different and a new style of music every time.
I think that was what I took away from it as well, was how he surrounded himself with this. Well, as you said, he didn't want to go back. I think whether in your film or I've heard otherwise, he didn't even listen to his old stuff sometimes or for years. But he surrounded himself with this amazing young talent. Each permutation of his career and next stage was just these amazing. I mean, what was it? One of the drummers was only 17, I think.
Yeah. I mean, so I mean, he launched so many careers.
Yeah.
Coltrane, uh, Cannonball Adderley early on. Later
Mm.
on, John McLaughlin. Tony Williams, the 17-year-old drummer. Keith Jarrett. Chick Corea. I mean, you
Yeah,
could go
amazing. Yeah.
on and on and on with the people that he really launched that launched out of his group. Now those people are great musicians, and so that
Yeah.
they may not have launched anyway, but the way that they did launch was by playing with Miles Davis.
And I think I can't remember his exact words, but he says something to the effect that one reason for that he's just looking for, as you said, he's looking for excellent musicians, geniuses some ways in their own right. And I mean, what do you think was the essence of Miles's genius?
I think that so many different things. I mean, I think that first of all, he loved music. And that for musicians and great musicians, music means something to them that it doesn't to most people. I mean, I like to listen to music, but I'm not obsessed.
Mm.
Just loved music and different kinds of music, and he loved change. That's just what he was. He was about constantly changing and developing, and trying new things. And he had a huge talent for finding great musicians, great young musicians, and playing with them. There's one line in the film from Miles where he says something like yeah, I play with young guys because I don't see what age has to do with it, right?
Yeah.
You either got it or you don't, and age has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
So that was a big risk that he came out and just stepped forward so many different times. He really risked it. I mean, look, Kind of Blue was recorded in like 58, 59, and that was, again, the most popular jazz album ever made. It's been the most popular jazz album. Miles Davis could have spent the rest of his career touring and playing Kind of Blue. He could have, okay, we're going to play Kind of Blue in order. Just the 5 or 6 tracks that are on Kind of Blue, we're just going to play it in order and over and over and over again. He would have made zillions, but no, he didn't. He said, okay, I'll play some of the songs off of there for a little while, but then I'm gonna go on,
Yeah.
Go on and do something different.
I do remember, because I my memory of him is as a kid, basically, and his stage where he was on TV a lot in the 80s, with all doing all the talk shows. But I do seem to remember an interview that struck me and has always stayed with me, was that he said something to the effect that he'd go to a Lakers game, an LA Lakers basketball game, and that everyone else is watching the game. They're watching Magic Johnson, and he says what he hears is the sound. I mean, the sound of the feet and the beat of the game. He could, in many ways, he couldn't turn it off, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's a great story. We actually don't use it in the film.
Yeah.
Teammate, a great musician, played with Miles. Told me that story. I mean, he was sitting next to Miles at the game, and they go to a basketball game, and Miles is like not even looking at the game. He's like still feeling it. And Toome's like, well, why don't you watch the game? What are you doing? And he said, I'm listening. And, Toome's like, listening to what? He's like, listening to the sound of the sneakers squeaking. Yeah. And if you ever been to a live basketball game, that's kind of the first thing you notice, that the sneakers squeak and make these sounds on the floor that you kind of watching on television. But that was Miles. I mean, just everything was music. All his life. When he first comes to New York at 18, he's going to Juilliard, famous school of music. He's going to Juilliard for classical trumpet, and at night he's playing with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, on 52nd Street. And then he goes home and he borrows scores from the library of Juilliard, and he goes home after those clubs end at like 1 or 2 in the morning, and he's reading scores and poring over scores with other musicians, classical scores, until the morning. Then he goes to Juilliard, and he's just, he's just soaked in music.
Yeah, and I think it strikes anyone who sees this film is that yes, it was jazz or whatever he wants to call it. I mean, seeing when you do watch archives of him, and we can talk more about that in a little bit. It's sometimes hard to know what to take serious sometimes when he's talking, but you get the feeling it didn't have, so he says, well, I don't call it jazz or whatever, but whatever you call the music, it could have been anything. He could have been an amazing classical musician. He could have done anything really, and he did do so many different things. But the film's called Birth of the Cool. What do we mean by the cool?
That was the title of one of Miles's first album. Was Cool, that he did with Gil Evans, the famous composer who he worked with, time and again, throughout his career. And I just thought that was a great title. I mean, that Miles was the coolest person on earth. They used to have that commercial. I forgot about the coolest guy on earth or something. I mean, Miles was the guy on earth. I mean, you have to see the film, but not only was he a great jazz musician, but he drove Ferraris and Maseratis. He went out with the most beautiful women in the world. Frances Davis, his first wife and longtime lover, is in the film, and she's just. I mean, so you have to see the film to understand what I say. But Frances is just like a trip. I mean, she's like something from Central Casting. In the film, she was a beautiful, beautiful dancer and his wife. I mean, he had it all. He had the tailored suits from the early '50s. The pictures of Miles, at the tailor getting his tailored suits made. He wanted the best of everything, and he was just really cool.
Yeah.
The other thing that we talk about in the film that I'm so proud that we're able to talk about this is Miles was a really dark-skinned African American, and at the time where if you had dark skin, you were not cool, you were not handsome.
Yeah.
But Miles threw that all away because as someone said to me, Miles was the handsomest guy he had ever been exposed to. That Miles was just pretty, especially in the early days, and he's not only pretty, but he's living the life, and he's making the life for himself by playing the trumpet, for a few hours every night, So Miles was, just a really interesting guy. So I mean, I just thought that the name Birth of the Cool, in some ways, led you into Miles' story.
Yeah, I don't think there are too many people whose silhouette is iconic. You could probably name those on one hand, and I think you see that on album covers or whatever. It's just his silhouette. Immediately it's Miles Davis playing the trumpet.
It's incredible, but also, I mean, the way he dressed. I mean, so I mean, we had literally thousands of pictures, because we had access to the Sony archives. Columbia, is now Sony, and the Columbia archives, Sony archives. Photographers, individual photographers who took hundreds of pictures of Miles, thousands of pictures. Miles was never not dressed. Not in one was he not dressed. Not in one. I mean, everything is like, whoa. It's just and not dressed in any way where it's like formal, or it looks like someone dressed you, what I mean, like someone wear this. No, he just like looked like that. Like Miles could wear a black suit and a white shirt and a scarf tied around his neck, and it
Yeah.
was, oh, he just was, something else.
Yeah. Yet, who was Miles Davis the man? Because like a lot of great artists, like many of us, really. I'm not saying I am, but I mean, he was complicated. He was a complex individual, wasn't he?
Yeah, and that's what really made the film exciting. Is that Miles was so complex. He wasn't, like some musicians that will go unnamed. Great musicians, great jazz musicians, but they're kind of one-dimensional. Miles was, you know, Miles was just an amazing individual. In that he made some of the most beautiful music ever made. I mean, the tender Miles Davis, makes you want to cry. That was great scene. I mean, it's like it's probably the sequence that I'm most proud of in all of 40 years or whatever I've been making films. But when we talk about Miles's ballads and the great affinity that he had for ballads, and one woman says, I want to feel like Miles sound.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And one thing I wasn't aware of is that what is it? The Louis Malle film that he did the score for. It's absolutely amazing, that scene you have archive of him just complete ad-libbing while just by watching the film, and that's what they went with.
Yeah, so Miles goes to France, I think in 1957, 58. And he just for a bunch of gigs, and Louis Malle, I think it might be Louis Malle's first film, famous French director. Yeah. And he asked Miles to do the soundtrack for a film that's in English called Elevator to the Gallows. And you can still actually get it. I watched it. And Miles goes in and he puts Louis puts the film up on the screen, and Miles plays directly to the film. And without writing anything, just kind of some sketches, and it's become one of the most famous soundtracks, probably the most famous jazz soundtracks in film. But it's so wonderful because they actually filmed Miles playing, so you actually see the whole and the screen, in the background, and you see the scene that he's playing to, and then we can cut to the actual film, cut back to Miles playing. It's just a beautiful scene, and again, the soundtrack is incredible.
I think we're going to take a little early break here for our listeners, and then we'll be right back with Stanley Nelson. You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America. Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with Stanley Nelson, award-winning director and producer of Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool. So, Stanley, how did this project come about? I mean, besides someone thinking maybe Miles Davis would be a good person to have a doc about.
Yeah, I mean, it has kind of an interesting gestation period. So I don't know, about 15 years ago, we thought about doing the project. I actually, kind of proposed that to a TV show in the United States called American Masters. Mm-hmm. Profiles artists, and they said okay, and we went and talked to the family who controls Miles' estate, and they said, yeah, I kind of was introduced to and met them, and they said yeah, and then for whatever reasons, the film kind of fell apart. But I kind of stayed in, loose contact with the family, and really my wife, Marsha, who's my partner. Mm-hmm. Kept saying to me, oh, what about the Miles film? You want to do the Miles film. Come on, what about the Miles film? And I was like, and I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, 4 years ago, I guess now, I finally, I said, okay. I called American Masters, And they said, that they had been actually on the phone, the week before with Eagle Rock Entertainment out of London, and that they wanted to do Miles, and that American Masters wanted to do Miles, and they would each put in half of the money, and let's go. And so I called the family, and they said, yeah, we're still down, if you direct, and that's how the project got started again.
And then how do you go about making a doc about a legend like Miles Davis? I mean, that's got to be a challenge.
First thing you have to do is make yourself so you're not scared. I'm gonna do the best I possibly can, and let the chips fall where they may. Again, I'm a huge Miles fan, and I understood his importance. I mean, one of the first things that I did was approach the editor, Louis Erskine, who I had made a couple of films with early on, The Murder of Emmett Till and Freedom Riders and some other films.
Yeah.
I love Louis, and we hadn't worked together for a few years, and he loves jazz, and he kind of has a real, he's kind of a real artist, and so I approached him, and he said that he would love to do it, and we just got started. I think that one of the things we had to do was make certain assumptions, or state certain. We can't include every album Miles ever made. There's 40 years of music, whatever. So, some people are going to say, oh, why didn't you include this album, or why didn't you include this song? And we'll just let chips fall where they may, because that's going to be, what we're going to do. And then, we thought really hard about how you kind of transform music onto film. I mean, that's, two different art forms. And so we really thought hard about that. And we really wanted to include a lot of music, because I watched a bunch of, documentaries, music documentaries, and sometimes, they're talking about somebody for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and you still have no idea what the person sounds like. Wanted to use a lot of music. I think we have like 62 different cuts or something. A lot of music. And we just kind of bit the bullet and went for it. But I also think that because Louis and I love Miles so much that we felt that we had Miles on our shoulder, like saying, mess this up, don't mess this up, so we tried to put everything that we had, as filmmakers into this film.
I think that's funny because I had written down here too. What would Miles say about this? Because I mean, even getting ready for this, I wasn't even thinking about the. I mean, I was obviously thinking about having you on, but the part of me kept thinking, because I don't know if it's in your film or something else I watched, where Miles is just basically telling the viewer to stop being silly and get straight to the point and ask the questions better and stuff like that. I mean, that's the kind of guy I was, and that's to have that voice, that very iconic voice in your ear the whole time. And then did you feel pressure to try to outcool the Miles Davis? I mean, that's got to, because it's going to be hard to please a lot of people with this film, because they're all going to have their own different kinds of expectations.
No, I mean, you can't outcool Miles. I mean,
no, you can't.
I admit that, freely. I mean, I couldn't try to outcool Miles. And I think that one of the things that we said, to Miles's family and Miles' state early on was that, I have to make a film warts and all. Some of the things about Miles, the negative things, drug use and other things, have already been stated and have already been known. And so, you can't avoid that. So that's part of Miles. And that's part of, what we went into the film, knowing that we were gonna put into the film, So, one of the best compliments I had in one of the first screenings that we had of the film with Miles's family is they said, hey, Miles would have loved this film. Miles was
Okay.
it's like, whoa, okay, that's all you need to say. I'm gonna go to bed because I, you know, think it'll be better.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. That's excellent. I mean, how did you decide how, I mean, there's various ways you could tell this story. Um, I forget the name of the actor you use who does the voiceover and all in, I mean, that's interesting. You use everything all the voiceover is completely Miles's words, aren't they?
Yeah, so Carl Lumley,
Yeah.
um, personifies Miles, and we used lots of quotes from his autobiography and other statements to have Miles be the narrator of his own life, and Miles, for those who don't know, had that very distinctive voice because of the throat operation, and early on in the middle 50s, and the doctor told him that he couldn't talk, for like a month. Like, don't talk, and Miles got mad at somebody and cursed him out. And so the rest of his life, he talked like this, talk like this. So that Carl Lumley, does hit the Miles kind of narration, for Miles' own words, in that voice, in Miles' voice. But also what was incredible is that every time, people who knew Miles told stories about it, they went into the voice, naturally. Like the first 3 or 4, people that we interviewed, like, they said, Miles once told me, you gotta play with more soul, man. You gotta play with more soul. So that was what they did. And so, then we started, saying, well, asking, well, if you quote Miles, you should use his voice, because, one person didn't, and it sounded really weird because everybody else did. That becomes, I don't know, I don't want to say running joke, but yeah, it's kind of a running joke in the film because everybody says, everyone when they quote Miles, and Miles was quotable. Right?
Yeah.
He cursed after every word, and and he just just like was a font of fountain quotes. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of that.
Yeah. I think even that's one thing I noticed as well, and I think it's apps. Again, it is a bit of not a it is a running joke. I mean, and I liked it, the fact that everyone had their own Miles impression, including his ex-wife, which brings me to these. You've already raised the amazing array of subjects and interviews that you have on this film. And sadly, or maybe, they were all getting up in age. Many have passed just even since the film was released. But thank goodness you got them all on camera. But I found, so we're talking about Frances Taylor, Juliet Greco. I noticed Jimmy Cobb and Jimmy Heath have both passed away, I think. But the interviews with Frances Taylor and Juliet Greco, those were so poignant. Especially, I think, Frances Taylor. I mean, I was just amazed by her. What was that like, interviewing her?
Before we did the interview, I'm in New York, and and she was in LA. I was speaking with somebody, and they said, you're gonna like Frances. She's got jokes, and I know what they meant, but interviewing her, I mean, the only thing that you can say is that she's a trip. I mean, she was just a trip, and she's really smart, and she's really funny, and it's like, wait, did she just say that? So she says this thing about when she first meets Miles, and Miles asks her out, and she says, like, nah, I didn't know anything about jazz. I didn't know anything about Miles Davis. What I knew is Johnny Mathis. She says it so so serious, and but she's just kidding with you, and joking with you all the time. I can say that it's something, I think, that that also has to do with her being so incredibly beautiful, You know, I mean, so if you don't know, look up "Someday My Prince Will Come." She's the woman that's on the cover of the album. Just look up the album "Someday My Prince Will Come." It's a picture of her. You know, I remember staring at my father's album when I was like 9 years old. You know, my prince will come, and I didn't even know why. But I was just looking at it because it's like she's like incredibly beautiful, and you know, just funny and smart, and you know, at first when we did the interview, you know, we really didn't know how to handle it, you know, because we had it cut up in different places in the film, and you know, finally one day I just, you know, went into the editor and I said, you know, let's put all the Francis stuff together.
Yeah.
Let's just let Francis go. You know, like let's just like get things off the horse and just let it go. You know, like because you know every time if he would cut to her and then you know cut to another story, then she would like steal the show, and so he just had to kind of like let Francis be Francis. You know, she's one of those things that you know when you're making a documentary film, you know, you just kind of you know you get into the edit room and you're like, oh my god, you know, like. I realized that it was a nice interview, but you know, I'm more worried about you know the lights and you know everything.
Yeah. No, I loved. I think she says, I had the best legs in Hollywood or something. And she goes, and I still do, or something like that. I mean, it's like, and she's in her 80s, and yet it's a very, you know, it's extremely. Well, credit to you. I mean, well, you're the director and you're acclaimed and award winning, but I think it does work so well keeping that all together because it is a very poignant interview because you can see even all these years on the love and also the anguish that was the nature of her relationships as well with Miles, and pointing again to this complex and you said warts and all character that was Miles Davis. So
You know that Miles, you know, had abusive relationships with women, you know, constantly all his life. And you know, we don't shy away from that. You know, we talk about that. And you know, Miles even talks about it later in his life, and Francis certainly, you know, talks about you know the Miles is striking her and you know and the horribleness of it. You know, so but again, I think that you know that as you say the love you know comes through that Francis you know as she says in the end you know I still love you know the other women that Miles you know was associated with that we interviewed. You know, I mean look you know Miles is a unique individual. I can't. I mean certainly you know if you have an affair with him or you know like she was with him for 9 years I think you know you don't remember it.
I want to, you know, you've got this amazing catalog of work, and one strain is, I would say, is sort of documenting Black men in the limelight, if that's maybe a poor way of putting it. But Miles Davis, you did the ESPN 30 for 30 with Michael Vick. You did the Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. I mean, are there lessons we can draw from, you know, sort of what Miles Davis went through as being this persona as a Black man who is also this cultural icon?
I think that you know as we made the film there's something that started to emerge and that really emerged in the final cut. That it's really you know not only the story of Miles Davis but it's the story of you know African Americans, especially African American men, you know in the mid 20th century, you know that the times that Miles lived through. And so there's a lot about Miles that's obviously unique, but there's a lot about Miles that obviously you know connects to all you know humans, but also you know also all African Americans, all African American men. You know, I think one of the running pieces in the film was that, and many people don't know, you know, Miles was born in East St. Louis, Illinois, and his father was the second richest Black man in Illinois. You know, he was violinist. Miles had, they had a house in East St. Louis, but also a farm outside, and Miles had a horse, horses all his life, and Miles was, grew up, very, very, very upper middle class. And, but still he grew up in, America at that time. He was born in 1926, and also, in East St. Louis, that's really the South, and Miles, so that being rich, couldn't protect him, that being, a great and celebrated jazz musician could not protect him. There's an amazing scene where, Kind of Blue, again, the most popular jazz album ever, has just come out. He's the talk of the town, and he's playing in a club downtown in New York, and a cop, he goes out to smoke a cigarette, and the cop tells him, like, move on, and Miles says, is my name up on the marquee, right? I'm smoking a cigarette. Why do I have to move on? And he takes a beating, from the cops. The cops jump him and beat him with their nightsticks. People run out of the club, and luckily, there's people who take pictures of him, so it's like a really well documented scene. Jimmy Cobb, who's in the film, is there. Francis runs down, when they actually arrest Miles. He's all bloody, and he's wearing a white jacket. There's blood all over it. Yeah. And that no amount of fame or prestige could protect him from the racism of America. And Miles internalized it, and so, but it's really interesting to me because, different people might have internalized it in different ways, right? I might have internalized it like, what the heck, so there's some bad people, but Miles really internalized it, and, it meant to him, that he could never escape, like, well, what can I do, to kind of escape the racism of the United States.
Do you think that drove some of the drug abuse and problems he had with substances?
I'm sure it drove everything. He actually says that, earlier on in 1949, he goes to Paris for the first time and falls in love with Julia Greco, and just plays gigs in Paris, and is a toast of the town, and he sees a different world. He sees a different world where the overt racism of white folks in the United States is not there. He's celebrated by the artistic society of Paris. Juliet begs him to stay. He leaves, and he becomes really depressed. And he says, it's on account of coming back to the United States. And the same thing, that was there when he left. And so many African Americans, in that period, and still, are kind of facing that, and move to Europe, and move, to Europe, because look, there's racism everywhere. There's racism there, but it's different. It's a kind of thing. Kenny Clark, the drummer that's with him, he stays in Europe. And so Miles, says that, and he says that just he really becomes bitter, and he cycles down into kind of the worst heroin habit that he has in his life, where he really, hits rock bottom.
I think, the one thing that your film reminded me of as well is a film that we've had here discussed on the podcast is I Am Not Your Negro about James Baldwin. And it's similar in that we get an actor they do the voiceover. It's all in James Baldwin's words as well. And it was, again, someone who moved to France and stayed. And what I think you do talk about in the film, and I know it's discussed in other ways, but what did Miles Davis mean to the African American community?
I think as he gained more and more popularity, so like in the late 50s, we talk about him as being an icon, to the African community. I think Ntume talks about the fact that you could just walk around carrying a Miles Davis out, under your, and that made you hip, so becomes, I mean, he becomes a standard of excellence. He becomes a black man, as someone says, who doesn't take any shit. He becomes, a black man who demands excellence, not only in his art, but also in his life. So, he's wearing tailor-made suits. He's driving Maseratis. He's creating some of the greatest music, of the 20th century. All, at the time when the civil rights movement is just kicking off. So Miles meant a lot to the Black community, that he demanded excellence, and it's hard for people who weren't around then to understand. But Black people in the United States weren't supposed to demand excellence. They weren't supposed to get excellence, right? You're supposed to sit on the back of the bus, right? You're supposed to go to the back of the restaurants. You're supposed to get the crappy hotel rooms. You were supposed to, you had to buy clothes where you couldn't try on clothes. In many places you could not try clothes. You had to buy ill-fitting clothes. You couldn't return it. It didn't fit well. Touched your black skin. No, you can't. So, but Miles demanded excellence, and he demanded excellence in everything. He also, he demanded excellence, in his gigs. So Miles would, they would tell, Miles and his group, oh, play another set. And he would say, pay me again. When you want to pay another set, you have to pay me, right? We have a great story in the film that we didn't use, where Archie Shepp, the jazz saxophonist, is going to Europe to play in a festival, and Miles's band is also on the plane, and Miles's band is in first class, and Archie's like he goes to the promoters and says, like, what the hell, why am I not in first class, right? And Miles, says to him, put it in the contract. In the contract that he and his band had to travel first class. And he changed the standards for all jazz musicians by the end.
It reminds me of probably someone, I guess, who's almost exact same age would have been. We've had someone who did the Chuck Berry documentary that's come out recently. Also a St. Louis product, and sounds in some ways reminded me of similarly. He was stories about how he would only get paid. It's different, but he'd only get paid in cash up front in a paper bag. That kind of stuff, and relayed some funny stories too about. I think he was here on a concert in the UK, and they were going to pay again, give him a bag full of pound sterling, and he wouldn't take it. He said, no, it has to be US dollars. And so they had to spend a good day just running around town trying to find 10,000 US dollars that they could convert and then put in a bag so he could still come on the show.
That a lot of them understand what, musicians, jazz musicians, rock musicians, any musicians, went through and probably still go through.
Yeah.
That, you're playing a club and the owner says, well, I'll pay you at the end of the night, after I get the money from the door. And then, you go to get your pay afterwards, and he comes with a couple of thugs, bodyguards, and he says, well, no, I'm going to pay you half because we only made half the money.
Right.
It's like, I'm paying you half, and two big, huge guys standing there with nightsticks and guns, that's what musicians, always had to work through. So, musicians learn, you got cash before, definitely you got to pay me before I hit the stage. Because once I hit the stage, I know you're not going to pay me.
Exactly. I mean, we were, just before that, we were talking about, that incident in front of the, I think it was Birdland, but that incident with the police and what he meant for the African-American community. I mean, in this year of sort of Black Lives Matter, and you as a documentarian and historian as well, I would say, what do you make of a year like this one, and or what do you think Miles would think of what's going on in the world?
Happy New Year. Marcos would think too. Like, let's just get the hell out of this year.
Exactly.
I think that, I mean, some good has come of the year. Some good has come with, with the murder of George Floyd, with Black Lives Matter. I think that for some white folks, they have had to, you know, really look at, where we are, way that they haven't. I think that hopefully, that'll continue, and that's not just a kind of a passing fancy. I also think that it's very discouraging and troubling. When 72 million people vote for Donald Trump, and it seemed like this country is so divided, and that the complete and utter failure of his presidency, and the over 200,000 people that had been killed when he was when the presidential vote came in, still didn't stop over 7 million people from voting for him. So I think that there's some reasons to be encouraged, but there's very many reasons to be discouraged. And the COVID, still rampaging through the United States, and certain people are saying that it's a hoax, and that failure and refusing to wear masks.
Yeah. I know our time's coming to an end, unfortunately, but if I may, I just have a couple more things I want to ask you, if that's okay, if you've got a couple more minutes. You're our first winner of a National Humanities Medal to come on the show. What was that like? And you got to go to the White House, and to have it presented by President Barack Obama. That must have been quite a thrill.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, they make it a great day, for you and your family. They say you can invite however many family members they want. My wife and 3 kids came.
Excellent.
And, get the award, and then they have a big, kind of huge buffet. I mean, like huge, and the Marine band is playing. And it's funny because when you talk about the Marine band, you think of a certain thing, but like the Marine band is made up of the best musicians in the Marines, and they can play anything. Like they played hip hop, they played jazz, they played. I mean, like they're incredible. And they you kind of can roam around, the White House, and spend a few hours there. So they kind of don't rush you in and don't rush you out, because they know that this is once in a lifetime thing. So it was very very wonderful, and it just made it even more wonderful that Barack Obama presented me.
Yes, I think. Well, and also, well, what's next for you? I don't imagine you have any plans to retire anytime soon. So, do you have any projects you can tell us about that are upcoming?
Yeah, I have a film on the crack era in the United States called Crack, and it actually just was announced a few days ago, and it'll be on Netflix on January 11th. They just released a trailer, so you can see the trailer for this film, Crack, and I'm really excited about that. And I'm working on a film on the Attica Rebellion, which will be the 50th anniversary in 2021. So it'll be out in the fall. I'm working on a bunch of other things. I just kind of love what we do, but also I should say that so my company Firelight Films is the production company, but Firelight Media works with artists of color, and it's in its 10th year in doing the documentary lab. So we work mentoring filmmakers of color. We've mentored over 100 filmmakers. We've won multiple awards at Sundance, Peabody's Award, Emmy Awards, and so we're doing incredible work, and I'm incredibly proud of of the work that we're doing at Firelight Media.
And with Firelight Media, what is I did come across that, and I think it's amazing stuff you're doing. What's one piece of advice you would give to aspiring young documentarians?
I would say, make sure that you really want to do it and that you love documentaries, because a lot of times you think about being on a podcast, or winning awards at Sundance, and that's a very slim part of my life.
Yeah.
Hard work of making the films, but really concrete advice I would say is see a lot of documentaries. You have the ability now to see almost anything, and just see films and understand films, and then learn how to use the equipment. Learn how to edit. Learn how to do camera. We had a guy who came to us on Miles actually, and he was a student at NYU, and not a grad student, just an undergrad, and he was kind of focused on editing, and he came as an intern, an editing intern, and then the assistant editor got pregnant, so then he became the assistant editor, and then he received co-editing credit on Miles. Then he was one of the editors on Vic, editing, someplace else, as an editor, and that's all in like 2 years or something. But the thing is that he knew how to edit. He knew how technically to use Avid, the editing program that we did. He's on his way. I mean, he's now paying his rent, buying his groceries from editing film.
Excellent stuff, and I think you can be said about most professions, but just having a passion and make sure this is something you enjoy doing. I think even as my children get to an age where they're starting to make those decisions, that's I think that's the best bit of advice we can give the up and coming generations.
If you like something, you have a much better chance of being good at it.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, can you imagine doing something you don't like doing? Because a third of your life or your adult life is going to be spent at least doing that thing, and if it's something you don't like doing, that's a long time. Well, and I mean, one last thing. Do you think this is a golden age of documentary filmmaking? That's we keep hearing about this. Would that be your impression?
It's a golden age of documentary filmmaking for some people, for people kind of established and and reached a certain height. I mean, I think that I'm being approached and looked at in a very different way than I was 10 or 20 years ago. But filmmakers that come through the lab, who've done one film, and and it can be an award-winning film, an Emmy-winning film, peabody-winning film. Usually they're not being chased by the cable and the others, and the streamers, so that for a few filmmakers that have been making films for years, that have many films under their belt, they're because now documentary film is much more of a business, and so what Hulu, Netflix, Showtime, HBO, ESPN, anybody wants is to limit their risk, and so by limit their risk by handling veteran filmmakers, like old filmmakers like me, and that they know will deliver. They know won't run off to Borneo with their money. Well, I'm thinking about it, but anyway, so I think that it's a golden age for some people. I think that for the majority of documentary filmmakers, they're still struggling, and in some ways, not that much has changed.
That's I think that's very interesting, and I think it's a very good point. Well, Stanley Nelson, I just want to thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. It's been an honor and a privilege to chat with you. To remind our listeners, Stanley's the director and producer of, well, so many films, but the main one we've been talking about is Miles Davis, Birth of the Cool. If you're a bit unfamiliar with Miles Davis, go pick up a copy of, or get on any of this, Spotify or any of these things, and look up Kind of Blue. and then watch this film, because I think I think it quite well sums up and gives you an idea for who Miles Davis was and the life he lived. I want to give a shout out to This Is Distorted Studios here in Leeds, England, and ask our, besides thanking our great listeners, but do remember to like us and share us with your friends and family wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off. You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.